Good day and welcome back to part 2 of our series on the B-BBEE certification. We're going to focus on the elements of the B-BBEE scorecard, and as you would remember, within the B-BBEE Act there is specifically five elements, and they include ownership, management control, skills development, enterprise and supplier development, and then your last one for socio-economic development. Those are the five elements of the scorecard. Within enterprise and supplier development, we've got enterprise development, supplier development, and procurement as three subcategories. So how we're going to deal with it in this presentation is to look at those three separately. So we're going to have 7 specific items that we look at, but they are congested or written up in the codes within 5 elements. The first element that we're going to look at is ownership. Now, ownership is probably the most difficult or the most emotional part of the B-BBEE scorecard, in that people always think that they have to give away some of their company or a portion of their company. Ownership is also the part that people think this is B-BBEE. If you don't know a lot about B-BBEE, people always start with ownership, and unfortunately that's not the case, or fortunately to some. So what is ownership? Ownership is actually the people who own the business, the shareholders of the company. It's got nothing to do with who runs the business day to day, although I do understand and I do know that within smaller businesses, the owner and the manager or director is potentially or probably the same person. But you might also have a director that is not an owner. And a lot of times you have owners that are not involved in the business day to day at all. If you think about the JSE and public shares, you might own shares in a company, in a listed company, but you're not involved in the company at all. The only thing you expect is some dividends and capital growth on your shares. So there's a very clear distinction between ownership and who runs the business, who manages the business. And we will look at management control after this. So how do you gain points on ownership? The ownership points is broken up into a number of subcategories. So you get 25 points. There's 25 points available for ownership. And within those 25 points, you need to score on whether there's male ownership, female ownership, a little bit in designated groups, which include youths, disabled people, military veterans, and the like. And then lastly, you have a calculation where you need to show that points accumulate over time and that you derive value. The black shareholders of this company derives value. Now, obviously, within BEE, we always talk about black, and it needs to be black shareholders. It needs to be African, Indian colored. Can't be white South Africans, because the aim of BEE is to transform a company. My take is always that you look at ownership only if it's really required at the end. So first start with all the other elements and see where you're going to end up before you make radical and drastic decisions regarding who owns the business. The last point I want to make about ownership is that you can look at different structures. And the structures that you can look at could be that another company owns shares, a trust could hold shares, and then there's also some very clever schemes or structures that can be put in place to get your ownership points. Ownership is also a flow of economic interest. So economic interests mean that there needs to be dividends flowing to the owner of that shares. If the dividends doesn't flow, if there's no proof that he gets value out of this investment, then you also don't get your BEE points for that. You can go and Google a bit and look at some different structures, or you can make contact with me. I've got a number of associates that we can utilize to get these structures in place, and that would give you your BEE points and allow you to continue with your business as normal. Now, as per the previous slide, we said that there's shareholding and then there's management control. Management control is the guys that run the business day to day. So who works within your business on different levels. And you get various points at differing levels. So you'll start at the bottom with junior management. So it's not your workers only, but we're looking at management. So junior management, middle management, senior management, and then we go to the executive and your board. So you get different points, and you also get different points for male and female representation. So you can't just have black males, then you'll only score half of the points. You can't also just have black females, then you'll score about half the points. So it's important that if you want to change your management control points, that you go and look at race, and you also go and look at gender. And that's something that we call the economically active population. So within South Africa, who are the people working and what race and gender are they? So if it's a balance of male and female, probably about 45% black males and around about the same, but a little bit more on black females, Indian males, Indian females, colored males, colored females. And it needs to be a portion of all of that. The majority of our population is obviously African, and a balance between those two would give you some good points already. It would be advisable to look at male and female at your top level already, and you can gain some points there. And then there's also an element of disabled, so you need to look at disabled people as well. You cannot include any white people in this. If a white person works in your business at any level, there's no points, because we are talking about black economic empowerment, doesn't include any white people. Management control is measured against your EA2 and EA4 that you submit with your employment equity plan to the Department of Labor, and it needs to be in line with that. Your organogram, your EA2 and 4, and you can't go and chop and change as you please. It needs to be consistent, and that will also come through in the audit. There's 19 points available for management control. It's not a priority element. Ownership, by the way, is a priority element. So management control is not, meaning you can score 0 here, no one cares, but you won't get a very good B-BBEE certificate. It is important that you go and look at your structures and see how you can progress over time and get people up to higher levels and improve your points through that process. Now, one of my favorite topics is skills development, and skills development is training. To get people uplifted, to get people to improve themselves over a period of time, and to get them to get some sort of education. And I think I know that it's probably one of the more expensive portions on the B-BBEE scorecard as well. With management control, you don't spend any money. It's money that you already incur in salaries. In terms of skills development, it's an additional cost to the company. And so much so that we, in the generic scorecard, talk about around 6.3% of your annual payroll that you need to spend on skills development. So how does this work now? So skills development is training of black people. You can get a little bit of points on informal training, but the majority of your training will probably be accredited training, industry specific, and then a very structured process. So to get your points, you need to spend 6% on skills. That 6% is broken up between 3.5% on any type of training, and 2.5% on bursaries. Now, bursaries is very expensive. You pay to university, and you don't get anything in return from that person that you pay the bursary to. You can also not claim the salary of the person that you put on a bursary. Then you need to train people on disabled people. That will provide you 4 points for 0.3% of your payroll. So not the biggest amount to spend, but sometimes it's rather difficult to have disabled people within your workplace, and it's mostly probably administrative staff. So potentially a nice area to go and outsource the training to a training provider that can also host the disabled people within their environment. Then your last part is what I call headcount. So it's the number of people that you train, and you take the number of staff that you have multiplied by 5%, and that gives you the number of people that needs to be trained. So if you have 1,000 staff, you need to put 50 people on a learnership to get those 6 points. In total, skills development is 20 points. It's a priority element, meaning that you need to score at least 8 points out of 20. Otherwise, you will lose a level on the BBEE scorecard. So it's important that you do spend some money on skills development. One tip that I can give you, or it's not a tip, it's in the regulations, in the codes, is that if you put a person on a learnership, you can also claim his salary. So if the person earns 10,000 Rand a month, for example, you'll already have 120,000 Rand of spend if he runs on a learnership for the full 12 months of the financial year. Add to that the 20-odd thousand Rand for training, it's 140,000 Rands BEE spend, where you actually just incur 20,000 Rand. And on that 20,000 Rand, you also get a nice tax deduction called the 12 capital H, and that section of the regulations or the Tax Act allows you to claim about 22,000 Rand, rounded obviously, from your annual tax, your income tax. So a nice way that government put an incentive in place for people to take part in BEE and to actually do the training as well. There's a lot of training providers, about 2,000 odd training providers in the country that are accredited to provide this training. I can also link you up with a few that understands the industry quite well. And it's important that you get documentation in place and the correct contract for learnerships and the spend that you incur, so that you are able to prove this cost to the verification agency in the end. As I said, skills development, the most expensive portion of the scorecard, one that people dislike quite aggressively because it could have the potential to disrupt, but also one that gives a lot of self-worth to your staff if implemented correctly. So next up, let's look at procurement. And procurement, remember, forms part of enterprise and supplier development as the 4th element on the scorecard. But today we're going to look only at procurement in isolation. So procurement is actually where government brought in this concept of self-regulation. So you're not forced to take part in BEE, it's your own decision. But through procurement, you actually affect the scorecard of someone else. If you don't have a certificate and they buy from you, they don't get any BEE points. If your supplier doesn't have a BEE scorecard, it means that when you procure from him, when you purchase from him, you don't get any BEE points for that spend. You only get points for the value or the level of the other person that you buy from. So it is important that we look at where we procure from, where we get the suppliers, and what their BEE level is. What happens here is that you have 27 points, including bonus points, available on the BEE scorecard. Those 27 points are made up of different subcategories, and it includes things like very big suppliers, where you can get only 5 points, but also forces you to look at QSEs, between 10 and 50 million Rand turnover companies, that you have to buy from them for a certain number of points. You have to buy from EMEs, which is below 10 million Rand, for a certain number of points. And then the last two is that you have to buy quite a bit of procurement from companies that are 51% black owned. That gives you 9 points, which is a lot of points on this scorecard. So it needs to go into that much detail that you don't just look at the BEE level, but you actually look at what the ownership of that specific supplier of yours is. And then you get more points if they're 51% black owned. And then the last one that I want to specifically mention is that if you procure from someone that is 30% black woman owned, so it doesn't matter that they're 51%, but of that 51% black ownership, 30% must be in the hands of women, and then you'll get a number of points for that as well. Important here, you don't need contracts, you don't need a lot of other things, but you do need to give the BEE certificate of the supplier that you utilize for your points to the verification agency. They're also at liberty to ask for the invoices and some other supporting documents as well. So it's important that you actually go and have a bit of a supplier database, or at least some contacts within the company that you can obtain it. If the scorecard lapsed, if its expiry date has already passed, then obviously you can't get the points going forward anymore. So it's important to keep track of that. A lot of the consulting firms assist you with obtaining those certificates, also be able to build a bit of a calculator for you. And one thing that is important throughout BEE is that you keep tracking on a monthly or quarterly basis the progress that you are making on the BEE scorecard in terms of spend. Because if you don't track that, you're actually going to sit at a point where you don't score the points that you need to, or that you thought you would, because things have changed in your business in the meantime. Yeah, so important. Look at the amount of spend, work out those percentages of each category, and then keep on tracking that throughout the year to see that you're on track with this. One of my favorite elements is enterprise development, and one that I'm passionate about purely because of the impact that I see that it has in young people's lives, but also in people that have an absolute passion for what they do. And yeah, the requirement here is that you spend 1% of your net profit after tax on enterprise development. So if you make R1 million profit, it means that you're going to spend 10,000 Rand on enterprise development. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, still money out of the bank. So enterprise development is not a supplier. It's not someone that you buy from. It's a company that exists, that's 51% black owned, and that you assist to get them to grow. So you can assist them through grants, you can give them a loan, you can give them goods and services. You can actually assist them with mentoring and accounting work, or whatever the case is that you believe would assist this company to grow. The easiest one is obviously to work through an incubator or an enterprise accelerator, and there's quite a number of them available on the market. When I work with a client, I always tell them to look at one where you are able to move this enterprise development beneficiary of yours to a supplier in the longer term. So you don't want to spend money on incubating them and growing them and never start trading with them. You can rather bring in a new enterprise development beneficiary. But then you have a supplier that's loyal, got someone that you have invested time in or money in, and that you are able to do business with in the longer term. Importantly, you cannot trade with an enterprise development beneficiary. So it's not someone that you do business with already. And in that case, it sounds like a little bit of charity, which it potentially is. But I think if you structure it well, that it can become a supplier later on, you're on the right path here. We can also go and look at the enterprise development incubators and go and see what they like in a later on session and how they can assist you with this. So along with enterprise development comes supplier development. Supplier development is 2% of net profit after tax, which means that if you have R1 million net profit, you're going to spend 20,000 Rand on supplier development. Again, not the biggest amount of money, but still some money out of the bank. Yeah, again, 51% black owned company. The difference between enterprise development and supplier development is that with supplier development, you are allowed to trade. So you need to procure from the supplier and you have to incubate them. And the incubation portion, that 20,000 Rand that you are spending, is over and above the procurement. So the portions of procurement, the spend that you incur, this buying from the supplier, doesn't form part of your supplier development. That is normal procurement. It makes him a supplier. But what you invest in him in terms of incubation or growing the business, for instance, you're giving them free goods or you're giving them discounts or you give him a grant to go and buy equipment, or you buy him equipment and you give that. That is actually your supplier development spend for BEE purposes. So you're still going to procure from them. It makes them a supplier, but now you have to also grow that business over a period of time. As I said previously, look at an enterprise development beneficiary that over time can be converted into a supplier, and then you spend more money in incubating them. Same supplier, but now they actually someone that you start trading with. You have the relationship, make it work, and there's also a bonus point for converting an enterprise development beneficiary to a supplier development beneficiary. We're now done with the fourth element called enterprise and supplier development that makes up enterprise development, supplier development, and procurement. We're going to look at socioeconomic development, which is the fifth element on the scorecard. And this specific element is really charity. So it's money that you invest in the community, it's money that you invest in education of black people, but it's not money that you spend within your business. So it's actually something that you put out there to grow the community at large, not suppliers, normally not businesses. So a lot of NGOs that plays in this space where they would go out and do early childhood development centers, community feeding projects, high school education projects, for instance. So it's a lot of charity, really. What is nice about this is that I always advise people that you need to ensure that wherever you do this, you get some marketing value out of it. And then one thing that people ask me quite a bit is, how does this differ from CSI, corporate social investment, or corporate responsibility? So the difference here is that this is only for black people. 75% of the beneficiaries of socioeconomic development needs to be black. And also there are certain specific requirements that you have to go through. So some of your CSI spend could also be socioeconomic development, but not all socioeconomic development, not all CSI is socioeconomic development. If you structure it correctly, the same spend could give you both. So you can have CSI, but you can also claim that value, that amount that you have spent. If you put the correct contracts in place, choose the correct beneficiaries, and ensure that they obviously more than 75% black, you are able to claim that CSI 0.4 socioeconomic development spend. As I said, a lot of NGOs set up specifically for this, and a lot of educational projects that run through socioeconomic development. The cost on this is 1% of net profit after tax. So again, if you have R1 million net profit, you're going to spend 10,000 Rand on SED. So in total, between enterprise development, supplier development, and socioeconomic development, you're going to spend 40,000 Rand, or 4% of net profit after tax, to get the points on BEE. Not a lot of ways to get away from the Rand value, but there are some clever ways within interest-free loans or longer-term loans that you can get away from not spending it every year, but it will cost you the money in the end. Very important that we look at this. It's 5 points for that 1%, but if you don't get it, you're probably not going to get onto the scorecard as you would have liked anyways. We have now learned about the 5 elements of the BEE scorecard at a very high level. We spoke about ownership, who owns the business, who are the shareholders. We spoke about management control, as in who runs the business, who manages it on a day-to-day basis. We talked about skills development, which is very expensive, but also a priority element that must be done. Then we had the combination of enterprise development, supplier development that also includes procurement. And lastly, we looked at socioeconomic development, all of which together makes up the BEE scorecard and would be able to give you a BEE certificate if you score above certain levels. In the next discussion, we will look at how this can practically be done as well. Now, if you have any other questions, you're welcome to email me at Rudolf, RUDOLF, @createinfinity.co.za, or you can just go to the website and fill in the contact form on that. There are some clever ways that you can look at managing your spend to the best of what you can, but also to get value out of BEE through marketing and through some other initiatives, and not just through spending cash and feeling like you're throwing it into a deep hole. Yeah, that's probably it for today. Thank you for making the time to listen as well. Enjoy.